I'm Lone Candle. If you don't support the Black Lives Matter movement, it is either out of ignorance or prejudice. Now, that's a strong statement, and I meant it. But I'll need to pare it back to make clear what I mean. So hear me out, alright? Just hear me out. After I explain this whole argument, I have some major advice for the Black Lives Matter movement that I think those who support them and those who don't will enjoy. So stick around for that. People who don't support the Black Lives Matter movement do so out of ignorance or prejudice. This claim isn't as outrageous as it sounds, because I'm using a low threshold for support. By support, I don't mean you're out there protesting with them, giving money, or driving around with their bumper sticker. I don't even mean you have to agree with some of their protesting tactics. All I mean is that you look out at what's going on and you see a problem. At the same time, there are people protesting this problem, and you support their general goals. You agree that there is a problem with racial bias in some police departments and in our justice system, and you support changes in policy that may reduce the deaths of blacks by police. That's a pretty minimal thing. So if your gut reaction to Black Lives Matter is, yeah, black lives do matter, and we should find a way to save more of them, then this argument isn't about you. However, if your gut reaction to Black Lives Matter is a swell of hate for what you perceive the movement as, if you instantly complain about some offensive or stupid thing some people associated with this movement did, if you go first to talking about other problems like gang violence, if you act like Black Lives Matter are some horrible organization, then I'm talking to you. Broader conversations are fine, but if you can't meet the minimal threshold of support I define here, then that makes no sense. And the only reason you would think this way is out of ignorance or prejudice. I'll continue the paring back by describing what I mean by these daunting terms. Ignorance just means a lack of knowledge. We're all ignorant about most things. There is too much to possibly know out there to not be ignorant. So it's okay to be ignorant, as long as you try to inform yourself when having a public opinion on a subject. I'm not calling you an idiot. All I'm saying is that some people are just not aware of the basic problem with blacks in law enforcement, and the nature of the Black Lives Matter movement. They haven't objectively informed themselves of the reality, and that produces their lack of support. Now, prejudice. I'm not calling you a racist. You can have prejudice without thinking blacks are inferior to whites on a genetic level. Most people hold prejudice to an extent. All I'm saying is some of our reactions and explorations into the topics that Black Lives Matter protest are biased by negative stereotypes and gut feelings toward black people. The majority of this video will deal with the problem. That is, trying to explain why the focus of the protests on police bias is a real problem, and it only makes sense for people to try to make changes. Then I'll go through some excuses people make for disliking Black Lives Matter, followed by a brief discussion on prejudice. Last, definitely not least, my genius yet simple idea for Black Lives Matter. Now, on ignorance. If someone understood what's going on between the police and black citizens in some communities, they would meet my minimum standard of support for Black Lives Matter. Let's briefly go over the evidence that there is racial bias in some U.S. policing. First, the horrific videos. We've all seen black men killed or roughed up by police in ways that don't seem justified. These clips are horribly graphic and are what have produced a lot of the outrage in society. We can debate whether some of the actions in those videos are justified, but it wouldn't be reasonable to claim all of them were. So the videos show that this shit does happen. Now, it's great to know that, but the videos by themselves are not strong evidence of racial bias. Yes, police sometimes make mistakes, and those mistakes can have deadly consequences, but these mistakes happen to all races. the videos don't show that this problem is worse with blacks. And they are not necessarily a representative sample of all violent mistakes. We need greater study to determine that. We need an understanding of how this happens and some statistics to back it up. FBI data show that blacks are killed by police at a greater proportion to their population. They are 13% of the U.S., but make up 39% of those killed by police while not attacking police. You often hear stats like these propagated, but this doesn't really help us because blacks also commit more crimes. Between 1980 and 2008, blacks committed 52% of all homicides. From 2011 to 2013, 38.5% of people arrested for murder, manslaughter, rape, robbery, and aggravated assault were African American. Racial bias in the justice system could exaggerate some of this, but not all of it. The National Crime Victimization Survey shows victims identify perpetrators as black at numbers greater than blacks' overall population. And the claim that blacks do commit a higher proportion of crime compared to population is supported by the study Crime and Human Nature. Now, blacks on average committing more crimes does not justify treating any particular black any worse, or more strongly suspecting him or her of committing a crime. The vast majority of every race are law-abiding citizens. So I don't mention these numbers to justify discriminatory policing. They simply show that the fact that more blacks are killed by police does not demonstrate biased policing, because we'd expect any subgroup of the population that commits more crimes to have more interaction with police wherein police violence may happen. Fortunately, there are studies that get past this. A study by Dr. Frere compared the results of suspects' interactions with the police, looking at what happened in the same type of circumstances. Even in the same circumstance, black people were found to be more likely touched, handcuffed, pushed, or have a weapon drawn on them by a police officer. So it doesn't matter that blacks commit a higher percent of the crime. A black person in a similar interaction with police and responding the same way has a better chance of a physical altercation than a white person. We want our officers to treat everyone equally, but they don't. Blacks are more likely to have a negative physical encounter even when reacting to the police in the same way. This study, however, did not find that blacks were more likely to be shot. The sample size was small, and other studies have found opposite findings, but it's an interesting result. It may be that bias produces more forceful interaction with blacks, but because shooting is such an extreme act, police use more restraint. Other researchers criticized his paper quite forcefully, so there really needs to be more study before we can confidently say police bias only affects physical force that is less than shooting. Even if blacks are only more likely to be roughed up by police, you can see why this type of treatment would lead people to respond extra emotionally to videos of people being shot. Conservative outlets have played up Frere's shooting findings, but other studies find that blacks are more likely to be shot in similar circumstances to whites. One professor found that unarmed blacks are almost 3.5 times more likely shot by police than unarmed whites. And he found that county-level racial bias in police shootings had no relationship with race-specific crime rates. So, the bias he found in shootings can't be explained by higher black crime rates. Washington Post data found that after taking threat level into account, blacks shot by police were actually less likely to be posing an imminent lethal threat to officers when they were killed, compared to white Americans who were shot and killed by police. This report said, quote, "The only thing that was significant in predicting whether someone shot and killed by police was unarmed was whether or not they were black." A 2015 analysis found no relationship between the level of violent crime in an area and that area's rates of police killings. Retired federal and state judges found that San Francisco police had racial disparities with regarding, quote, stops, searches, and arrests, particularly for black people. And this may be expected when San Francisco officers had sent racist text messages. When looking at people searched without consent, the report found that blacks and Hispanics had the lowest chance of actually having contraband found on them. Whites were found with contraband at almost 2 times the rates compared to blacks. A Chicago task force also showed that white drivers were twice as likely to be found with contraband. Illinois' Department of Transportation data showed that white drivers were 49% more likely than blacks to have contraband discovered during a consent search than blacks in the same search. The New York Times found that in Greensboro, North Carolina, police chose to search black drivers more often, even though drugs and weapons were more often found when they searched whites. It also found that officers were, quote, more likely to stop a black driver for no discernible reason. And they were more likely to use force if the driver was black, even when they didn't encounter physical resistance. Looking at 19,000 use of force incidents between 2010 and 2015, a Center for Policing Equity study found that blacks were more likely than whites to have police force used against them, even when racial crime rate differences were taken into account. A 2010 Governor's Task Force found that black and Latino police officers are more likely to be killed by police. In cases of mistaken identity, 9 out of 10 off-duty officers killed by police between 1982 and 2010 were black or Latino. A 2007 University of Chicago study found that in simulated shooting exercises, police response speed showed anti-black bias. By reviewing the research, the Sentencing Project said that only 61 to 80% of higher black prison rates could be explained by higher crime in black communities. The Department of Justice did a thorough study on the Baltimore Police Department and found that it had engaged unconstitutionally in a way that led to blacks being stopped, searched, and arrested at disproportional levels. Similarly, another Department of Justice investigation into Ferguson, Missouri, found that blacks were unfairly hit with traffic stops, force, and jail time. Even another DOJ investigation in Cleveland found that their police had a pattern of excessive force. In Baltimore, one black man in his 50s was stopped 30 times in less than 4 years, resulting in 0 citations or criminal charges. And when searching white people, Baltimore police officers found contraband twice as often than when searching blacks during vehicle stops. So blacks were being overly targeted with stressful and time-wasting searches. According to Human Rights Watch studies, blacks and whites use and sell drugs at about the same rates. But from 1980 to 2007, blacks got arrested on drug charges at population-controlled rates of 2.8 to 5 times higher than whites. Blacks make up 14% of regular drug users, but make up 37% of those arrested for drug policies. Why are so many blacks being arrested on drug charges when whites use and sell drugs just as much? This indicates some major racial bias in the war on drugs. And the bias doesn't stop with police. On average, blacks receive longer sentences for the same crimes and are more likely to be sentenced to prison in the first place. So to sum this up, the available evidence overwhelmingly supports that in at least some areas of the United States, there is anti-black bias in our policing. Police stop and use force against blacks at rates and in situations that are not justified by the level of black crimes or the actions of the target. Let me take a moment to say something about police in general. A major part of this video is criticizing police, and I don't want to give the wrong impression. Police have a job where they are willing to risk their own lives for the protection of others. Not many people are willing to do that. I respect and am thankful for the bravery of police officers. Please don't take my laying out some negative evidence as an argument for dissing police as a whole, or any sort of justification to be disrespectful toward police officers. Police have a damn hard job. They deal with people who are, or may be, breaking the law, and who surely don't want to be bothered by someone who's going to get them in trouble. They do our city's dirty work, so the rest of us don't have to. Just because there are problems with policing does not mean that most police are not honest, hardworking, and competent. However, police do have great power. They are legally allowed to take away our freedom and our lives. Their word is given powerful weight in court. With great power comes great responsibility. And in a democracy, we have to be able to discuss, even negatively, the jobs of our police officers. We wouldn't truly be a free democracy if we couldn't examine the behavior of those with such authority. If I've made a mistake, point it out. But don't act like this is an anti-police tirade, because it's not. We don't just have studies showing discriminatory practices. Police officers have come out and told us about it. A black cop who served in St. Louis named Reddit Hudson wrote an article describing how he personally saw the racism and racist acts in his department. He agreed with the idea that in a police department, 15% of the officers will always do the right thing. Another 15% will abuse their authority if they can. And 70% of the officers will follow the pack. If this is true, that means the culture of particular police departments is incredibly important to preventing abuse and discrimination. And knowing this helps us see how we can have such institutional bias and abuse in some police departments. He even says that in a situation where police can abuse their authority, the victims of that abuse will usually be blacks or Hispanics, because those are the victims cops can get away with abusing. Talking about those 15% that are bad apples, he says some officers intentionally violate people's rights, and he describes a few examples of such incidents. Another black officer, Neil Franklin, who worked for decades at the Baltimore Police Department and the Maryland State Police, said that he had bias against young black men. He said, quote, "When I'd see a young black male in a particular neighborhood where his pants were sagging a little bit, or he walked a certain way, my first thoughts were, oh, I wonder if he's selling drugs." This is a black cop who developed racial bias against blacks. This shows how tough policing is in problem communities, where, while the vast majority of people are law-abiding, there is a lot of crime, and it is mostly committed by young black men. It's hard not to associate a certain look, a particular race, with bad behavior, when those committing the bad behavior are mostly of that category. The problem is, most people of that category do nothing wrong. Franklin's testimony shows how serious of a problem racial bias is. Even those who start the job with little to no bias may become biased against blacks. And then this makes the problem worse, as a community who's discriminated against is less likely to work with cops to help ferret out the bad guys. Not only are members of these communities less likely to help cops, but they may be uncomfortable when cops come by, making them look suspicious and worsening the problem. His testimony reminds us that it isn't only white officers dealing with their own racial bias, but black officers also. Black police officers kill black civilians too. Psychologist Josh Correll ran a video game simulation where people had to determine which suspects should be shot based on whether they possessed a weapon. All types of test subjects shot black suspects faster than white ones, no matter the race of the subject. A key problem that creates discrimination is something called implicit bias. A variety of studies on citizens and cops show that Americans tend to have anti-black bias. We live in a society where all too often the criminal we see on the news is a black male. We have a long history of racism against this category of people, and negative stereotypes exist. It's very difficult to grow up in this society and not perceive blacks as more dangerous. When police officers carry this bias, it can lead to the unnecessary death, punishment, or harm of black citizens. I hope it's becoming clear that while some true racists exist, and they may sneak into our police departments, the bigger problems are probably bad cops who abuse blacks because that's who they can get away with abusing, and a racial bias that we all struggle with. I've just done a general overview of the evidence. I encourage you to dig deeper. But the evidence is clear. There is a real problem. Cops do discriminate, unintentionally and sometimes intentionally, against blacks. If you lived in a community where most people around you believed that police abused you, and then saw videos of police horribly and apparently unjustifiably killing someone from your community, and you personally experienced unnecessary suspicion from police who have the power of law to take away your freedom, would you not want to protest? Not only is it understandable why people would protest, the evidence shows that they're right. How could you act dismissively or with hate toward the Black Lives Matter movement when you understand that they are protesting a serious and real problem? How could you not look at the situation and at the very least say, yeah, I agree with their goals? Yet so many people respond like Black Lives Matter are just a bunch of assholes. Criticizing their tactics is one thing, but responding the way a lot, maybe even most, white people do just doesn't make sense. There are several excuses people give to act the way they do toward Black Lives Matter. One is tactics. While often Black Lives Matter has traditional and peaceful protests, sometimes their activists are more aggressive. They block roads, block stores, and interrupt political candidates. Now, if the reaction to Black Lives Matters were to the effect of, I don't like some of their tactics, but I understand their goals, then I wouldn't be making this video. But often people simply say, I don't like them, in an angry voice. I ask why, and they mention some rough tactics. The tone of their voice and choice of words used to describe the movement is hardly justified because of some destructive tactics. You know what usually happens to protests that stand in their designated spot, chanting off to the side? They're ignored. They are ineffective. The reason they use aggressive tactics is because they see people in their community being harmed by the officers meant to protect them, and no one seems to be doing anything about it. Everyone seems to be ignoring the problem, so they are trying to make it so you can't ignore them. We live in a democracy. Change in public policy can only come if the people recognize the problem and demand it is acted on. Blacks make up 12% of the population. They need others to support them. They need whites to see this problem. And if whites are going to ignore their regular protest, I can see why they'd try something more aggressive. Now, I'm not saying I support such protests. I don't know if they're worth the backlash from people annoyed because their day was interrupted. There may be other ways to get people's attention. My only point is that aggressive protests alone are not a reason to poo-poo the Black Lives Matter movement. And remember, much of their protesting is the traditional kind. I don't know how many times Black Lives Matter comes up and someone shows a video of some supporters chanting horrible things about cops. Then this person says, see, they're cop haters. Yes, if it was official Black Lives Matter policy to say disrespectful things about cops, I would hate them too. Or if this was a common thing that a large plurality of Black Lives Matter supporters did. But it's not. Yes, some people get carried away with their chanting, but for the most part, that doesn't represent the movement. It is completely unfair to attack a group in total because a minority of their group does something stupid. Any movement or political interest will have people that say stupid shit. Anyone who attacks these groups for what the riled up fool says is a dick. It would only be reasonable if such behavior was encouraged or condoned by the group as a whole, which it's not. Black Lives Matter leadership repeatedly say they don't support this. And why would they? It only hurts their movement. Generalizing from bad apples is part of the whole problem in the first place. Let's not do that here. And people get more ridiculous than just generalizing about offensive chants. Lots of people truly believe that Black Lives Matter is a violent organization. This is false. They do not support violence or condone violence done in the name of Black lives. Lots of people say, well, I've never seen them say this. Have you looked? Just because your media sources don't show you what is obvious to anyone in the know, doesn't mean it didn't happen. Some criminals commit violent acts, but they are not a part of the Black Lives Matter movement. There are political organizations that support violence. The Black Panther Party was one of those. They advocated the destruction of property. They had to be broken up by the FBI. But Black Lives Matter are not the Black Panthers. Black Lives Matter is a protest movement, not a violent one. Some people have the audacity of pointing to the shooter in Dallas who gunned down police at a Black Lives Matter protest and blame the movement. The protesters were horrified. This was one crazy gunman. Don't blame the protesters because some asshole ruined the rally by committing acts of terrorism. It's very well possible that a few deranged people who sympathize with Black Lives Matter jump to the conclusion that they need to kill cops. This is true with any group who thinks they are fighting injustice. Are we going to say pro-life activists are violent because a few in their number murder doctors? No, because their movements don't advocate or condone these actions. If we value free speech, then we can't blame any protest movement because someone who sympathizes with them commits criminal acts. One critique of Black Lives Matter is that they should focus on black violence. While this would be a great thing to focus on, it's not a reason to avoid supporting Black Lives Matter. As we've seen, there is a problem with police discrimination. Even if there is another problem out there, it is still a good thing to try to fix this problem. I'm not against the building of a road in Mississippi because Alabama also needs a road. Black Lives Matter might not even be successful on its current goals. And now people want them to expand them? It's perfectly okay for a group to have narrow goals. If there are policies that can limit police abuse, then we should implement them. Whether or not other problems are solved, if good can be done in this area, then it should be. Now, there is a point that far more blacks are killed by black-on-black crime than by police. And the ultimate solution to this problem is making troubled communities economically successful and reducing overall crime. That will go a long way in reducing bias in the first place. But that's easier said than done. Proposed solutions for police abuse are things like body cameras, new types of training, and independent prosecutors. These things can be done relatively easily. How do we stop young kids from growing up in neighborhoods run by gangs, and how do we induce economic growth in communities that have failed to have it for decades? That is fucking hard. Don't get me wrong. We should focus on these things and do whatever we can to solve them. We have to for our country to be great for all of its citizens. But I could certainly understand why an interest group would have narrower goals, focusing on things that people are currently more incensed by and on solutions that are relatively easier. If you're concerned about black-on-black crime, rather than insulting a group that is focused on doing some good in a related area, why don't you go out and do something about it? I do think the lack of focus on street violence is a legitimate criticism, just not a reason to not support them at all. And I'm not actually so sure such a focus would be better. On one hand, we may think that solving street violence is more important. It kills more people and makes the police bias problem worse. But straight numbers are not everything. While a death is a death, the two types of death are not an equal injustice. Being treated fairly by one's own government is a basic value in a free society. Killing and discrimination by those who are here to protect and serve, and who have the authority given to them by society, is a greater injustice than two gang members killing each other. Especially when police can usually get away with their actions, while citizens will be aggressively prosecuted or revenge murdered. So the injustice may make the police bias problem worse than the street violence problem. Furthermore, as mentioned earlier, street violence solutions may be harder to implement, so efforts there may be less fruitful, and the perception of injustice makes the street violence problem worse. By society not working with police, and by communities acting extra nervous around police, making police more suspicious, the street violence problem then becomes worse because police have a tougher time getting the bad guys. So, not working on the police bias issue makes the black-on-black crime problem worse. They affect each other negatively, so helping one helps the other. Finally, perceived injustice can lead to other ills, like a disregard for the law, riots, and a general hopelessness that leads people to be less productive members of society. So if we wanted to do the most good possible and could only focus on street violence or police discrimination, it isn't really clear which one would be the better use of our time. And this, of course, is just an aside, because either goal is a good one to work on, and frankly, our society is big enough to work on both at the same time. I'm arguing that many people don't support the Black Lives Matter movement out of ignorance. I know about this because I was once one of those people when it comes to the phrase, all lives matter. When I saw people being booed for responding with all lives matter, I was like, oh man, these activists are riled up assholes. But you know what? I was wrong. I just didn't think about it enough to realize the dynamics. For anyone who understands what Black Lives Matter is protesting and what their goals are, it makes no sense to respond with all lives matter. Black Lives Matter is looking out at society and seeing that black lives seem to be valued less. Blacks are killed and discriminated against in ways that doesn't happen to other people. It is as if black lives don't matter. But they do! So they're saying that. They are in no way saying that black lives matter more than others. A news comic pointed out the problem with all lives matter pretty clearly. Imagine two houses. One of them is on fire, while the other is sitting pretty. A fire truck siren blares its around the corner and pulls up to the burning house. Firemen jump into action, hooking up the hose and unleashing water upon the flames. Then a bystander walks up, points at the house not on fire, and says, "All houses matter." This makes no sense. Of course all houses matter. But it is not the house that's on fire. We're not focusing on the inflamed house because it matters more, but because it is the one in trouble. When people responding to a particular problem in the black community say Black Lives Matter, and you respond with all lives matter, it's dismissive to their concern. Why would you say that? Do you not understand that they implicitly mean Black Lives Matter also? Do you not care that blacks are unfairly treated by police? Are you ignorant of the problem? White people see the phrase Black Lives Matter and think it's about them. White people, this isn't about you. One more analogy. If I, my dad, my brother, and my mom are sitting down for dinner, and my mom serves my dad, then my brother, and then sits down to eat herself, leaving my plate empty. And I say, "Hey, what about my food? My stomach matters." Then my mom responds, "No, honey, all stomachs matter." I'd be pretty pissed off, because my point is exactly that. Right now you're acting like my stomach doesn't matter because you're ignoring my empty plate. I think all stomachs matter, and am pointing that out by saying that mine matters also. I'm not going to say much about prejudice. The only reason people don't support Black Lives Matter is due to ignorance and prejudice. Ignorance is clear. If you just don't understand the problem or the nature of the group, you may not support them when a more informed you would. While for some, prejudice works through outright racism, where they literally think Black Lives matter less, for most, it's more subtle. If we have bias against blacks, then we're more likely to be more skeptical of their claims of victimhood, more likely to jump on criticisms of their aggressive protesting tactics, or what some of their members say, or of their narrow goals. We may be less likely to do the proper research to see what the problem is or to discover the nature of the movement in the first place. We're more likely to accept what a friend, a media figure, or a social media post says about Black Lives Matter, as long as it's negative. And we'll more quickly dismiss those defending the group. Even when attempting research, prejudice will make us more accepting of information that supports our stereotype of those uppity black protesters, while we'll have higher standards of proof for evidence that goes against our predispositions. If you or someone you know is harshly critical of Black Lives Matter, ask, would they be so harsh if the protesters were white? Would they jump to the same conclusions about a group not negatively stereotyped in our society? Prejudice prevents us from understanding the evidence and logic on both sides of race-related issues. And even when someone has informed themselves decently, they can still come to the wrong conclusion because of their racial bias. Remember, Martin Luther King's movement in the 60s was opposed. even the revered March on Washington. Right before this march in 1963, Gallup polled the country, and less than a quarter of Americans had a favorable opinion. Among whites in a 1966 Harris survey, 85% of them said similar protest actions by blacks would hurt the advancement of civil rights. If you are one of those so ready to dismiss, dislike, or disrespect the Black Lives Matter movement, stop and think. Are you really so different than those who disliked Martin Luther King's protest? I'm not saying these two movements are equal, okay? But if people, through ignorance and prejudice, could get Martin Luther King so wrong, then similar factors may affect the hearts of men today. To be overly critical of our current black civil rights movement. Okay, so I've gone over why people would so viscerally dislike the Black Lives Matter movement. But now, I got some advice for the movement that both sides may like. Or hell, this advice may appeal more to those who don't like the movement than those that do. I'm not going to go on about better advertising proposed solutions, finding ways to influence actual lawmakers, controlling the chance of more ludicrous protesters, and the backlash of certain aggressive tactics. I have simpler advice. A name change. Your current name and hashtag is Black Lives Matter. I believe it should be changed. Not Black Lives Matter, but Black Lives Matter 2. Hashtag Black Lives Matter 2. TOO. Look, I know the 2 is implied, and anyone who isn't ignorant or blinded by prejudice obviously knows you mean Black Lives Matter 2. But you're trying to get attention and influence people. The world isn't fair, and human beings are only rational to a small extent. You are in a PR war, and a PR general can't stubbornly cross his arms and say, they should just get it. No, people are fucking stupid. They don't get it. I know. Why people should know the slogan Black Lives Matter isn't about them. It's not saying Black Lives Matter more than white lives. It's not suggesting all lives don't matter. It is specifically arguing that all lives do matter, but black lives are treated like they matter less due to racial bias in the justice system. But damn it, obviously lots of people don't get it. You got to make it explicit. Black Lives Matter 2. Black Lives Matter 2. Black Lives Matter 2. I've even seen some interviews where Black Lives Matter leaders say there's an implicit 2 or also at the end of the slogan. It's just time to put it there. Will this solve all your problems? No. But it makes your name and slogan instantly recognizable as arguing for love and respect for all. I mean, don't give white people an excuse to think you're just a bunch of whiny but blacks. Don't! There is a negative stereotype that whites are all too willing to jump on. And non-whites too. I'm just picking on whites because that's who I come in contact with, who are also ready to dismiss Black Lives Matter as a bunch of whiny little selfish Negroes. So for the PR and clarity of your movement, change all your websites, all your signs, and all your hashtags. Black Lives Matter 2. Black Lives Matter 2. Black Lives Matter 2. You're welcome. And I expect a royalty check if you profit off the new name/slogan. Well, I'm Lone Candle. Like me, comment me. Like me, comment me, love me, Lone Candle, bitch.